IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I'm your host, Suman, and with me, I have my colleague Mihir, who is an adjunct fellow and works at the intersection of tech and policy at Takshashila. Hi, Mihir.
Hi, Suman. Good morning.
It is also our immense privilege to have with us a very special guest for the show, M R Sharan. He's the author of the book Last Among Equals, Power, Caste, and Politics in Bihar's Villages. Hi, Sharan, and welcome to the show.
Hi, Suman. Hi, Mihir. I'm very happy to be on this show. Thank you for inviting.
Firstly, congratulations on a wonderfully well-written book. I couldn't have asked for a better way to start the new year. The flair for writing and everything that you have woven together on a topic which not too many people consider interesting, and the kind of insights that it provides is really, really fascinating. I'm so happy to have started my year with this book, So thanks for writing this book. And to all our listeners, it's a recommendation that we would want to make to you to not, forget or definitely pick up this book and read it. Yeah. So let's start the show. Sharan, can you start just a bit about yourself?
Thank you so much for that, for those lovely words about the book too, Suman. And I look forward to an exciting conversation. So about me, since Takshashila is based in Bangalore, I actually grew up in Karnataka. I went to school there, high school that is. And then after that, I went to Delhi University to do a bachelor's and a master's in economics. After that, I kind of became interested in development economics while being in Delhi. And then I worked in a series of, in a couple of research projects first in Andhra Pradesh, and then I moved to Bihar in 2012. Subsequently, I did my PhD at the Kennedy School at Harvard, where again, I studied development economics, but also more public policy related stuff. And that's basically my background. So it's kind of a journey from, say, starting in Manipal in Karnataka. And now I'm currently assistant professor at the University of Maryland. Again, I teach economics there. And that's my academic journey.
Sure. Thanks so much for that. Yeah, like you mentioned, you are an economist, but unlike the traditional image we have of an economist, that one who crunches numbers, spouts jargon, generally providing yarn, you have actually spent time on the ground in rural Bihar. What took you to Bihar, firstly, and how did you come to study this in this book that you have written? How did this book come about is what we're looking at.
Yeah, so I think if you do research in economics, one of the first things that hit you, especially if you do research in mainstream economics, which is what I do mostly, is that there is a gap between what you produce in your research papers and the world that you're seeing. So that gap is basically what this book is trying to fill, in the sense that when you go to the field, say when you go traveling around Bihar, working on on evaluating government projects, which is what I was doing initially, or studying how a new government policy takes shape on the ground, I encountered a lot of people, not just in the bureaucracy, but also in local government, also people in villages who had a lot of ideas, thoughts, jokes, heartwarming tales, which you really can't put in a dry economics paper, because the format and the current way an economics paper is written is very kind of cut and dry. You have there's a literature, you have to kind of appeal to that literature. You have your quantitative, I work in the quantitative development economics space, not so much theory, but even the quantitative space, often there's a particular format, and you can't really put in a lot of the things that add color or flavor or emotion to what you're seeing. And you can't really add that into your economics paper. So that's basically what happened. The other thing was the way I would deal with this kind of distance between what I was seeing and the kind of research I was doing was I would write these emails. I had a series of emails I wrote to a kind of close family and friends called Bihar Vignettes, because I spent a lot of time in Bihar. I lived there for almost 18 months, first continuously in Patna, and then subsequently I did a lot of my PhD field work there. So between 2016 and 19, I spent a lot of my time in Patna. I was running a team in Patna that kind of worked on policy. This was through the IDFC Institute. And so basically what all of this meant was that I got a lot of time to engage with things on the ground in Bihar. And I would kind of send all these vignettes, these stories about what I was seeing to this close friends and family. And at some point, I guess when I finished the PhD, there was a kind of a little bit of a void that I had vomited, in some sense, all the stuff that I had kind of, done during the PhD to this thesis. And there was kind of a gap. And then the pandemic hit. And I had previously written a novel. This is like, again, before the PhD. And so my literary agent actually kind of wrote to me saying, hey, well, I saw that you finished your PhD. Is there another book in the offing? And I said, you know what? There are all these notes from the field. I've always wanted to make that into a book. What do you think? And he said, yeah, go for it. And so I should thank actually Kanishka Gupta, my literary agent, for kind of sparking that thought of the book. But that's basically how the book came about.
Yeah, your flair for fiction and storytelling clearly comes out in the book. The various, popular culture references that you make of movies and other stuff. I mean, it's a wonderful way to connect to readers and to connect the story to larger audiences. I guess people otherwise cannot connect to Bihar or the rural landscape as such. So that was really a wonderful part of the book for me.
I mean, I've been a
I
movie
echo
buff
that.
forever. Yeah, go on, Mihir.
Yeah, no, Sharon, I wanted to echo what Suman said and what you said earlier is that I have myself studied and read a lot of economics papers. And as you correctly put it, there's a certain format, there's a certain literature, there's a style that you have to follow. And you're essentially writing for a professional audience that's looking for a certain kind of input. And there are a lot of these gaps, as you mentioned, that can't be put in a research paper. But the stories actually work for taking the research as well as the ground reality, mentioning the ground reality, and also taking the research to the people. So really happy to see your book, especially an immensely readable book with your prose style, to become available. And so first, congratulations for that. And I'm sure Suman and I will take you up on some of the style linguistic choices that you made in the book as well. So I did want to start, Sharon, with one question. Is a large chunk of the book talks about the rural economy and how the rural economy works and how government policies and schemes potentially impact it. And one of the things you talk about is extensively is the MNREGA, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. As you have called it, it's popularly known in these parts as the NREGA or the MNREGA, depending on who you speak to. But could you maybe just to refresh our minds and for listeners who may be unaware of the exact specifics, can you talk about what at a high level NREGA is and when it came about and what it offers to the rural people?
Yeah. So NREGA actually is a social safety net. What it basically does is if you're someone who lives in a village anywhere in India, on paper, you can walk up to your village head, which is called an adhyaksha in Karnataka, who's elected, or a mukhya in Bihar. You can just walk up to them and say, boss, I need some work. Please give it to me. And the government and the mukhya are supposed to give you work within 50 days of you applying for work or asking for work. So that's what the law basically says. Okay. So this was a law that came about in 2005. It came about because of a lot of very interesting and very strident work by a bunch of activists across the country, but primarily in Rajasthan. And they basically said the following. They said, look, there's a lot of seasonal migration that happens. People in the summers in the villages don't really have any work because that's after you've harvested and you're just kind of waiting around. And so instead of migrating to the city and kind of striving for work there, why not there be something in the village that you can try and do? And the government should be able to provide the work. Now, the big question, of course, is what kind of work should the government provide? And the NREGA law was actually very interestingly framed because it said you have to give work that actually helps improve the village. So you can build roads in the village. You can get a bunch of people to come together to build a pond. You can get a bunch of people to come together to, plant trees. All of this actually happens on a regular basis across the country to this day. So it's been 15 years and not thousands, crores and crores of workers have got work under the scheme. And they have, of course, been paid and everything. This is not to say that the scheme works like it should on paper. Almost nowhere is work provided on demand. It's almost always that the local government, the adhyaksha or the mukhya kind of saying, okay, this is the summer months. So we have some money to implement some projects. Why don't we now kind of give out work? That's how it usually happens. And almost always there are some delays in payment. Okay. So this definitely happens, which means that it's not really working exactly as it should. But even this kind of partial working offers a lot of succor to a lot of really poor people on the margins of society. These are people who can barely do 3 meals a day. These are people who lived in thatched houses. These are people who come from the most disadvantaged caste groups. They live kind of far away from the main village, often especially in caste-based, caste-segregated villages, as we see in Bihar, for example, or many other parts of the country. And so for these people, having the option of getting some work, and often these are women, by the way, because the men can still afford to go out and, in the cities or go to the neighboring town or whatever and try and get work. What do the women do? I mean, they also need work. And once they have children and their children are somewhat old, you need the second income in the household, especially if the man is away. And so all of this means that NREGA offers succor. I want to end by saying two things about NREGA. Both after demonetization and after Corona, one of the big things that came to help the poor in villages of India was NREGA, right? So after demonetization, you had this very moving, very sad sight of so many poor workers leaving the cities and kind of going back to the villages. And when they went back to the village, they were out of work, of course, because they went back because there was no money, there was no cash in the urban areas. So they went back to their villages. And the government then kind of, economic survey of, I think, 2018 shows this. The government really did a lot to kind of ramp up NREGA to kind of offer succor. And exactly the same thing happened in a much worse way in some sense after Corona too, right? We all know the stories of migrants walking back home. And again, when they went back home, NREGA came to their rescue to some extent. Again, this is not saying NREGA works as it should, but it still offers a lot of succor.
Thanks, Sharon. And I agree with you. I mean, we have seen a lot of reports and papers, even from the government. Even the government expenditure on NREGA has gone up dramatically during the last 2.5 years during the COVID times, which indicates that the likely demand for work is very high as well.
Mm-hmm.
But let me ask you a theory question, Sharon. Is NREGA one of a kind in the world, or are there employment guarantee schemes elsewhere? And how does India's scheme compare with, to your knowledge, what's happening in other parts of the world with respect to either provision or guarantee of employment or other kinds of schemes that provide income to the poor, especially in the rural areas?
So that's a great question. I must preface the answer by saying that I'm not an expert on public work schemes across the world, but let me say this. In Africa, at least, I've seen a few research papers that seem to talk about how NREGA can be seen as a template for kind of designing public works programs. I think the biggest difference between NREGA and most of these schemes across the world is, as you correctly pointed out, it's an employment guarantee scheme, right? So you basically and it's justiciable by law. People have a right to work under NREGA, which makes it very different and much more powerful than it does in most other contexts where it is the case that the local administration decides to give work to some people, and so that you can shore up aggregate demand during times of crisis. This is not how NREGA was envisaged, and this is not how, even though this is not exactly how things happen on the ground. It's, as I told you, still not completely work on demand. The fact that it exists on paper allows people like, say, Sanjay Sahni, who's the protagonist of the book, who I'm sure we'll come to, and the workers in rural areas to kind of collectively demand some kind of work and get things done. So to answer your question, I am not aware of a right to work, like an employment guarantee scheme, exactly in the format that NREGA is. NREGA often is dubbed, I think incorrectly actually, the more I see it, as the largest anti-poverty program in the world. So given its scale, given the powerful nature of the law, I don't think there are many other examples across the world that kind of mirror NREGA.
Fascinating. Actually, that does bring me to kind of the next question. Is you said that these are the contours of the scheme and it doesn't work perfectly, but it does work. So, and you mentioned Sanjay Sahni. So I know your book talks about BMW, and BMW finds a lot of mention in your book. And as someone who has read the book, I don't want to let the cat out of the bag, but BMW is not what it's commonly understood as. So would you mind telling us a little bit about BMW and your experiences with it?
Yeah, so BMW actually stands for Bihar MNREGA Watch. As Mihir pointed out, MNREGA is another way of kind of referring to NREGA. And BMW actually is an anti-corruption group that was started by this person called Sanjay Sahni. The book actually, one half of the book deals with the experiences of Sanjay Sahni and how he basically left his job as an electrician on the streets of Janakpuri in Delhi. So he was someone who had a kind of a small shop on the street, and he was an electrician. People would come to him and say, fix my light or do the wiring for my house. And he would go and do that. That was basically his job. And by complete chance, he discovered corruption in the NREGA through an encounter with the internet. I kind of describe that in great detail in the book. It's actually a fascinating...
What a story. What a story that is. My God.
Yeah, it's an incredible story. It's actually one of the great victories for the framers of the NREGA law, who kind of had the foresight to say that we'll put everything about this law, we'll make it public, right? So that was actually a great victory for them. The hope actually was that there'll be many more Sanjay Sahnis across the country. And while some have sprung up, sadly, they remain too few and too far in between. But yeah, but Sanjay discovers corruption in his village. And he's kind of like in a frenzy. He's like, oh my God, this scheme exists. People are supposed to get work, but nobody's getting work. But somebody is saying that they got work and taking all the money and kind of just fleecing the government. And he goes back to his village. He kind of does all these checks and he's like, completely caught up by the fact that there's so much corruption, and he thinks he's landed on a gold mine of some sort of corruption. Little does he know that this was actually really common, especially in the early years of the NREGA, that there was a lot of corruption. I mean, I would, for example, say that Mihir would work for 50 days on building a road, and I would get a machine to come and build that road. And then I would take all the money that was going to Mihir, I would just kind of pocket it. And I here be the mukhya of the village, and these other local bureaucrats knew how the inner contours of the scheme to make money off it. So Sanjay Sani goes back to the village and then he says, okay, I'm going to try and fight corruption here. And it's a remarkable story because he actually manages to bandy together a group of mostly women from the most marginalized groups and the most spirited, passionate women that I have encountered, at least in my life. And they come together and they're like, no, we're going to fight the mukhya, we're going to fight the local bureaucrats, and we're going to start a group called the Bihar MNREGA Watch. And basically, that's BMW. And the book basically documents the various encounters of BMW and its later avatar, the Samaj Parivartan Shakti Sanghatan or SPSS, and how they go about trying to fight corruption in NREGA, trying to actually bring to life the NREGA's original principle of giving work on demand. So they actually file work demand applications, they storm the local bureaucracy offices, they do strikes, they kind of, really try and jolt the government into action. And the book is about how these extremely marginalized people are fighting for not just their rights, but also for dignity, for respect, and for their livelihoods. And so that's one half of the book.
Fascinating. And I do want to kind of ask you one follow-up question, since we talk about NREGA and there's a massive kind of misunderstanding of what kind of work is done. And you have yourself written in the book about spending time at a NREGA work site. You've written about people who participate in the work and what kind of work they do. But can you tell us about, for example, let's say the work is digging is constructing a pond in a village. What is the work site like? How many people? How many days? What kind of tools do they use? And I mean, it's supposed to be unskilled labor, but I can't imagine in rural Bihar in the peak of summer with all the heat and everything that any of this is easy to do at all, or the wages are commensurate. But can you talk about both the work conditions and the wages on a NREGA project as an example?
Sure. So, for example, let's take the example of, say, cleaning or building a path for the river to go through it. So, irrigation canals or whatever. And that's basically what they call mitti ka kaam, which is basically working with some kind of mud. And a lot of that involves, say, about 50 to 75 workers on a work site. They work for at least, if it's a good work site, when I say good, it is a work site that offers a lot of employment. It will go on for 2 weeks or 3 weeks if there are 75 workers. And their work starts early in the day. Like you say, in the summer, it's so hot that even I, who kind of grew up in Manipal, who's kind of used to some kind of heat. Manipal, of course, is a heaven compared to rural Bihar in the summer. But even then, it's really hot, even for people who have spent all their time only knowing summer. And so in this heat, you have these workers kind of working with the most basic tools like, those spades and axes, and then kind of slowly kind of working on the mud to kind of clear out the path so that the canal kind of is cleaner. Or, as you said, in the construction of a pond, there'll probably be a little bit more people. There'll be maybe 150, 200 people if it's a big pond, especially. One of the images that comes to mind when I think of a pond is it was a village in Gaya. And that's the first thing you see. Like I was doing a survey on NREGA. This was the early days. I'm trying to figure out how NREGA works. And you enter this village and you see this massive pond, right? Like it's like you have a hill at the back, like a reasonably big hill. And Gaya is very beautiful parts of Gaya. And in front of the hill, there's this like huge pond. And they told me that 400 workers had worked on it for like a month. And work starts very early. It starts at 5 a.m. and goes on till about 11 to 12, because after that, it's impossible to work, especially in the summers. And a lot of the workers are women, especially in the context that I am familiar with. It's women who are in their, say, late 30s to mid 50s, because these are women whose children are old enough to take care of themselves. And so they can actually go out in search of work. And they are often chatty, especially the morning. If you go, there's a kind of buzz, there's an energy, people are working, they're chatting. In some cases, there are some kids on the work site who are kind of playing on the side. Then there is the NREGA mate, who's basically one of the workers who's also responsible for taking attendance and keeping the muster roll ready and all of those things. And then they pause. They pause every maybe couple of hours for water, and they take turns to pause so that the work keeps going. So they drink water, or they drink some sattu and water. Sattu is basically this mixture of various delicious. It's the equivalent of podi, I think, is the closest thing. If you had podi in South India, that's something like what sattu is. So they have sattu juice. Basically, they mix the sattu with water and they drink it. And it's a quite, it's fun. And there are points which is fun and points which are like not so much fun, because a lot of just quiet hacking and hacking. But it's very tiring work. And I would be very surprised if everybody works for 6-7 hours a day. And I don't say this as an indictment of these people. I just think it's, as you said, it's really hot and it's really hard to work. So I think they all work like maybe 4 hours, 5 hours, but they all show up and they all do this kind of community collective work. And that, I think, is something else that's important about NREGA, that the framers of the law got it right. They realized that by working together, you're also bringing the community back in some sense. And you're getting very people to band together, kind of do work together. And that's a very important aspect of a work site. So that's an example of a community work site, at least.
Fascinating. And how much does it pay, Sharan? Just too curious.
Now, I think the minimum wage, basically, suppose they're supposed to pay at least minimum wage. Some states have more than that. So in Bihar, I think it's 198 rupees per day. It used to be 120 when I first got there. It went up to 144, then 158, then 177. I think right now it's 198 rupees per day, which is basically minimum wage for a lot of work. Sometimes payment is also done based on amount of work you do. So they do these complicated measurements and then try and decide, oh, okay, you work this much, so we should pay you this much. So that's basically how it works. So it's very little pay for very hard.
Yeah, at this point, we will take a short break. We will come back with more questions on NREGA and all other parts of the rural life in Bihar, as you have detailed, after this short break.
Working Monday to Friday glued to your chair making you feel dull? Worry not. Get your 5-minute weekly dose of travel around the world with Postcards from Nowhere. Join me every Thursday as I explore the strange, obscure, and fascinating parts of the world and bring out facets of travel you may not have thought of before. You can find us on the IBM Podcast app, website, or wherever you get your podcast from.
Welcome, everybody. This is a fascinating discussion we are having with Sharan, Bihar, MNREGA, and a lot of other things. So carrying on from there, Sharan, my question is that you have said, this whole movement, the BMW and then the SPSS as such, was mostly done by this semi-literate man with few hundred women. Now, has this movement done anything for gender parity or gender rights or gender representation as such within Bihar? Do we see more of them coming out into the public space? Do we, see them being more participative in, say, as in the SHGs, or have you seen any women mukhyas around, or what is your experience?
So that's actually a very good question. Also, because this has been something that I think has been central to the SPSS story or the BMW story, because primarily most of the members are women, and these women have been actually really brought out into their own in some sense through the participation in the movement. I'll give you examples at multiple levels, right? So the first thing is that they all show up for these meetings. And of course, there are SHGs. Bihar actually has a fantastic SHG system called Jivika. I'd encourage listeners to kind of look that up. But this is different from SHGs. It's more like, people actually coming together of their own accord, not because some government is asking them to come together. And they're trying to band together to try and make the state work according to their means. So first, you have the meetings. The meetings often happen in the BMW office or increasingly in some public space. And so you already see these women coming out. One of the sights of rural Bihar life is the colorful clothes that these people end up wearing. And so especially in the winter, in that hazy winter light, the coruscating brilliance of the saris is something that really strikes you. And so that's the first example of people coming out into more public spaces. But beyond that, like I told you, these women also then go to government offices and then ask for work. Right? So that is a big act. Imagine you're a Dalit woman, who for all her life has only been working as a casual wage laborer in your landlord zamindar's field. And that's all you know. That's been your world, your home and this field that you go and work in. And then you have your kids, and that's basically your world. Now, suddenly, you are actually carrying letters that has work demand under a rega or a petition to get rations. And you're showing up at the block development officer's office. That's a really big deal for a lot of these women. I write about some of this book too. And so that's another example of them coming out into the public world a little bit more. But then there's a third level, which is that, okay, so you go and you make petitions and stuff. The third is you actually participate in strikes. So if you look at any of the BMW photographs of strikes, it's basically a sea of women and banners. And so you really see them coming out. And when the media shows up, often especially increasingly now, Sanjay is very comfortable with the women taking center stage. So you find like the Madhesri Devis, who's one of my favorite people in the Ratnauli, where BMW is headquartered. Madhesri Devi coming out and in her shrill voice making these fantastic passionate calls for equality, for justice, for work, for gender parity in wages. It's really nice to see. And at the fourth level is basically what you said, which is contesting local election. One of the people I saw who went from working with BMW to becoming a sarpanch of a village is this person called Lucky Devi. It's a very nice name. It's Lakhi, not Lucky,
Okay.
but it's still a nice name, I think. So Lucky
Okay.
Devi is someone, who became a sarpanch of a village, and she used to be one of the organizers, mobilizers in BMW. She used to in a separate panchayat called Amrak. And slowly people started getting to know her. She stood actually to become Mukhya. And in Bihar, there are two positions. Mukhya is the person who does everything. In the village, the Sarpanch only solves disputes between households. She wanted to stand for Mukhya, but then they convinced her out of it and they said, no, stand for Sarpanch. And when I say they, it's the village elite. Because I think the elites were so scared that she will become a Mukhya that they kind of almost bullied her into taking a slightly less powerful position, which is the sarpanches. And she's actually done really good work as a sarpanch over the last 5 years. So that's one example. But there are many other BMW women workers who have become, local ward members, local mukhyas. Sometimes they are Indra Awas Yojana, which is the housing scheme. They have a sevak in every tola. So Indra Awas Yojana Sahayak is what they're called. So that way they've kind of infiltrated the local state at a small level. And then finally, of course, the biggest way they really kind of expanded their horizons is through going to newer and newer panchayats. This has been happening throughout the last 10 years, but at an increased speed over the last couple of years, where they travel to new panchayats to get more women to join them. And this is again an example of going beyond your village, going to a distant village, maybe 100 kilometers away or 70 kilometers away, and talking to other women and men there saying, hey, you know what? We figured out a way to crack the system a little bit. It requires all of you to come together and start a people's movement like the way we did. And often women do a much better job of getting other women to come than men do of women or men do of men, because I think especially with MNREGA, women need it more. And B, I think women are much better at collectively mobilizing. There's a community spirit in them that I find very inspiring in a way that I don't see in as many men. I'll make one criticism though of the way BFW works. I don't talk about this so much in the book, but let me just make that here. I think the one thing that we haven't seen as much is that in the end, it's still very much a Sanjay Sahni run movement. And there are many valid reasons for why something like this happens in any company, any organization. The founder kind of gets a much bigger profile than the others. And even here, then this is a conversation that Sanjay I have had for years. Many other people have had with him. He has had it with other women, where we are always encouraging him to kind of elevate even more and more women into the top kind of leadership. And he's doing it, but it's slower than what would be ideal.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks so much, Sharan. That was enlightening. Yeah. The needle is moving, but it's moving in a very, very small and, measured steps, as we can call it. But yeah, that's a very heartening way to look at this problem, especially where we are seeing labor force participation falling, safety is an issue, and so many other things around gender that we see these days. Yeah, so that was a heartening note. May you want to take the next?
Yeah, thanks, Sumit. Sharan, I think the key factor that I took away from what you said earlier is that women are demanding this work. Women are making sure they get it. Women are making sure they get paid and petitioning and all the different moves. But I think my understanding is that the MNREGA daily wage that you referred to earlier is gender neutral. And that's probably a very, very unusual thing in rural Bihar, I would imagine. All other work, as tends to be around the world, tends to be not gender neutral, or the remuneration tends to not be gender neutral. Is that something you think that the framing of the law kind of, was that a deliberate choice, or how did that come about? And is that kind of a anomaly in the general economics of situation?
So again, it is, again, a lot of credit to the framers of the law. So they definitely kind of always envisaged this as a gender neutral space, and they wanted women to kind of get parity for pay. And you're exactly right when you say women don't get equal pay otherwise, right? So because in most cases in private casual labor market, you don't get a daily wage, you get a piece rate, right? So if you cut this much, so if you have to harvest grain, if you cut this much grain and you kind of deposit, you get a portion of that grain, or you get some money based on what the value of that grain is. That's how it works. And given the way our society works, women often end up cutting not as much as men. The average woman will end up cutting what the men do, and so therefore the women get paid less for the same number of hours of work. But of course, there's a lot of unpaid work that women do for society, especially in the domain of the household, which kind of needs to be compensated for in some way at some point. And I think NREGA does a great job of kind of ensuring with gender parity that some of that compensation begins to happen. The other important thing is, as a principle and a policy, it's useful to have a framing that allows for something like this as a statement, as a social statement, right? And so that's again something that's really great. So you've exactly hit the nail on the head when you say that gender parity in pay is a very important element.
Fantastic. And then I do want to bring you back to your economics training and some of the theory and some of the research around NREGA. So one of the kind of, and unfortunately, even 15 years after the law came in and millions and millions of hours of work have been done, there is an impression in the urban areas that NREGA is plagued with a lot of problems. I mean, and I think a lot of criticism comes, one, at the design, that by providing a price floor, if you will, for labor by guaranteeing a certain amount of work at a certain rate every year. It potentially distorts the labor market or so on, or can potentially be inflationary in the rural areas if the wages go up. That's some objections I have seen in the urban interpretation. And then also, of course, and you referred to this, that the implementation is often not perfect, that it may result in the creation of unproductive assets. Maybe the canal is dug, but it is either washed away or doesn't really last for long, and then you're digging the same thing over and over again. That's something that a lot of politicians have also said. Politicians who have opposed the NREGA is that it pays people to dig trenches and fill them up and so on. Or that the kind of things you referred to, the siphoning of money that should go to the poor instead goes to the mukhya or someone else who's in the sarkari system. So you actually have used the word that there's a sarkari zindagi and then there's an asli zindagi for NREGA. And there are these design as well as implementation related questions. So granted, no policy can be kind of perfect in incentive design or implementation. But what's your take on both of these impressions that people have?
So let me put on my economist hat and kind of see if I can convince you by citing some literature on this. I talk about this in the book. But before I put that hat on, let me tell you an anecdote that also features in the book. Right. So I was doing field work in Andhra, and I met this kind of the husband of the serpent of a village who had like a lot of land. Like, I forget how much now. I have it in my field notes and it's also in the book. But let's say about 100 acres of land. And I had gone to meet him. And of course, he didn't let his wife come and talk to me because he said, no, she works inside the house. This was a ready landlord. But that's something else that you kind of learn if you do field work in India, that, as you go up the caste hierarchy, women become more and more confined to the house. And so, and then only in the urban areas, you see this kind of breakup, or in like very elite castes in the villages. So this landlord basically sits and tells me, and he asked me what I did. I said, I trained in economics. And so he said, oh, even I have a master's in economics. So he said in Telugu, he said, మీరు ఒక ఎకనామిస్ట్, నేను కూడా ఎకనామిస్ట్. Let me tell you the economics of NREGA. He said, because of NREGA, there's so much wage inflation. I'm unable to practice my agriculture. And I was just like, wow, this guy has like, hundreds of acres of land. I'm sure he can afford to pay a few extra rupees. And yet he's like, oh, this is destroying agriculture and I'm unable to practice it. It's a collapsing rural economy and agriculture because of one scheme that promises 100 days of work across the entire household for the rural poor, right? And think of that a little bit. There are 2 to 3 able-bodied workers in a household. So we are basically promising about 30 days of work per worker. Also about a month's work by the government at minimum wage is somehow going to cause so much inflation and threaten so many people that agriculture collapses was always a little bit of a fishy thing. But now, putting my economist hat on, let me say that there's a very nice paper by Karthik Muralidharan, Sandeep Suktankar, and Paul Niehaus called The General Equilibrium Effects of the NREGA, where they basically ask this question itself, which is that does NREGA actually make things worse by kind of creating this wage floor causing inflation? They actually find that NREGA is actually improving rural productivity because for once, workers are being paid a minimum wage. That's actually a very counterintuitive finding. And the reason that counterintuitive to mainstream economics, not counterintuitive to people who worked in the field for a long time. Basically, what happens is NREGA gives workers a wage floor. So in extremely power
Asymmetric.
unbalanced societies, power asymmetrical societies, the landlord is able to capture most of the surplus in the economy and give very little to the workers. What NREGA basically does is it says, no, you have to at least give X amount of rupees to every worker. And the worker doesn't necessarily have to work on NREGA. All they say to the landlord is, if you don't give me work, I'll go work on NREGA. So if you actually see, even now, the average number of work done per household in NREGA is only some 30 days or something across the country. So it's not like anywhere close to the 100-day limit. But NREGA basically gives workers the option of kind of bargaining better with the landlord. And that basically allows the surplus to actually go more in the hands of the worker. And workers spend more of their money. That's because their consumption expenditure is higher. So that actually fuels aggregate demand. This is again, I'm putting my economist hat on, but basically what that means is you spend more money. When you spend more money buying things, there's more money going out in the economy, which means more things are made, and that actually causes a multiplier effect. So NREGA actually improves rural wages, rural productivity. The only losers are the landlords who anyway had too much wealth to start with. So this argument that NREGA somehow destroys the local economy or is making agriculture unsustainable doesn't really hold out in the data. Okay. I'd encourage you to see the Kartik Sandeep Paul paper. But beyond that, also, this talk about corruption, I just want to say one thing on corruption. It is true that NREGA was the hotbed of corruption. I would say in some sense, at least 12, 13 years ago when the scheme first came out. But it is a testament to the framers of the law, the bureaucrats at the top, the politicians at the top in both UPA and, many state governments. And now, there are several BJP governments that also want NREGA to work, where they have kind of constantly tinkered with the functioning of the law and the implementation of the law in a way that it made it more and more and more transparent, such that corruption now, which was kind of endemic and kind of everywhere in 2007, 8, is much more reduced and constrained. And there's always going to be some amount of corruption in any government program, but it's important to see if that corruption is going down. And in NREGA's case, I think we could almost undeniably emphasize that it has gone.
Fascinating, and I'm glad, Sharon, that you've stated that so categorically and based on research. And I'm sure for professional economists, this provides a lot of material to perform research on. And while at this, I mean, NREGA is not only a kind of an employment scheme for the rural poor, but if I may say, in a lighter vein, for development economists, it's something that they have probably enjoyed observing and learning
Yes.
from and calibrating the theories.
Yes. It is NREGA is the treasure trove for a development economist because of its real time data, and it's got infinite amounts of data on every part of the country. So, you have papers not just on NREGA and say rural wages, you have papers on NREGA and violence. So, there are like thousands of papers, and it's made many careers.
Thanks, Sharan. We'll need to take one more short break before we come to the final part of it. We promise we won't take too long.
Hey everybody, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Cyrus Says, writer-director Suban Verma tells Cyrus what it was like co-directing Season 2 of The Family Man. In their new miniseries, Ek Sawal Kai Jawab, the Pulyabazi hosts ask, how much should the government's tax income be? What's life like in your 40s? Actor Sikandar Khair talks to Ritasha and Ayushi on Agla Station Adulthood. On All Things Policy, the Takshashila folks shed light on a probable global treaty for pandemic management. And on Say No to Drama, Chetna explains how to give up on the stress of not finding solutions to our problems right away. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. We really do appreciate the word of mouth. Also, don't forget to rate us on any of the platforms that you're listening to us on, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever it is. And we are also on YouTube. On YouTube, you can check out our various channels on ivmpodcast.com/YouTube. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Bank of Baroda and CoinSwitch Kuber. Thank you for making this possible.
Welcome back from yet another break. And we are in this fascinating discussion with Sharan on the rural economy, the MNREGA, and everything Bihar. I don't know if we can capture everything about Bihar in this short time that we have, but a few other themes I would like to touch upon and ask Sharan a few questions are, First one is MNREGA is actually, you have used MNREGA to shine the light on various structures of the government and various other contentious issues within the rural economy as such, rural societies or economies, whichever way you want to put it. The most contentious one, probably for everybody out here, is reservation. We know how everybody talks about reservation in different societies, in different in different structures as such. The ultimate fault line in the Indian society is caste. We look at it from a benefits lens more than we look at it from a representation. Sharan, so could you summarize for us the issue in Bihar? And you've used the Nali Gali, Nal Jal scheme, etc. in the book to tell us, a few things about the caste system. The it's just so abhorrent. I can't even get my head around it. But yeah. So could you just tell us your experiences over there?
So I think let me start with this empirical fact about caste in Bihar at least. So we have data. We use data from the socioeconomic caste census that was briefly public for a while. And so what we do is for every surname in Bihar that at least is repeats about, say, 2000 times or something, we have a threshold. And we say for every surname in Bihar, let's calculate what is the average wealth of that surname using data. Okay. So, and the socioeconomic caste census has some indicators of wealth. So we put together a wealth score and we do this. Basically, if you look at the bottom 9 surnames in Bihar, in terms of wealth, they all belong to scheduled castes or they're all Dalits. It's a staggering fact that 70 years after independence, when so much has been done for the upliftment of, or at least on paper, for the upliftment of the most backwards and class of the Indian society, you still have this kind of amazingly sad statistical fact, which is that the lowest castes in the caste hierarchy are also the poorest castes, or the wealth distribution maps on perfectly to the caste distribution, at least at the lower echelons of society. This is a staggering and a sad fact, right? And in terms of my own encounters with caste in the village and why reservation I think at least is important, especially in the context of local politics in Bihar, I spent some time talking about a lower caste, a Dalit wedding I went to in Bihar in the book. And what that wedding really brought home to me was the abject poverty of these Dalit hamlets. Except in the main headquartered village, which is Ratnali, they're all extremely backward castes. Often there are some Dalits, but those Dalits are upper Dalits. But there are a whole group of Dalits who are called Mahadalits in Bihar who are extremely poor. And going to that wedding, and I describe that in great detail in the book, and looking at, the very basic nature of the arrangements, the kind of food we were served, the places that we ate in, the wedding hall itself, which is not really a hall, it was a house, and how basic the whole thing was really drove home to me. And this was someone, I was much younger. It was really eye-opening and kind of sad to see. And it really drove home the fact in a real way that what I'm seeing now in the data is also true in the real world. And that basically is why reservation is so important, because in the end, in a democracy, everybody should have equal opportunity. Everybody should have equal representation, ideally, or at least the class of politicians who represent you should look a little bit like the society, underlying society. And Bihar offers a great comparison because in 2001, when there was no reservation for leaders in Bihar, at the panchayat level, less than 1% of panchayat leaders were Dalits, right? And this is a place where 17% of people are Dalits. So you had this kind of great, amazing inequality where these Dalit workers and Dalit women and men were not being able to actually get into local government. And reservation really changes that. It changes the profile of the people coming into power. But reservation alone, of course, is not enough, as anybody will argue. But in the light of these kind of stark disparities, it is almost impossible to argue that reservation is not required. And then I kind of show, again, using a lot of data in my book, that reservation actually helps Dalits get access to public goods, increases their wealth. Reservation for 10 years actually, kind of spawns more political participation by Dalits, such that Dalits no longer need reservation. Many of Dalits can then just contest elections on their own and continue to win. And there is this virtuous cycle between political participation, wealth and asset accumulation, and public good provision for Dalits, which then makes more political participation possible, which then makes more wealth coming through, right? So reservation kind of kickstarts a process that's a virtuous cycle. So I kind of see that also in the data, and this is based on data. And finally, I show how, in using very real world stories, how these Dalit members of local government, there are these guys called ward members who are extremely local elected officials who are below the mukhya, but represent about 200 households, really tiny jurisdictions. 200 households is like 3 streets in Bihar. Imagine how densely populated Bihar is, right? So you'll find 200 households in like packed together, and they'll have one elected representative called a ward member. And that ward member, when that ward member is Dalit, often has very little powers. And I show how just giving them even that power, they are able to kind of fight and lobby and get things done for their people and build pipe water schemes, drains in their villages, in their hamlets, and historically kind of marginalized, discriminated groups suddenly seeing things happen for them. These are all like very nice, tiny green shoots in a sparse landscape, but they're important green shoots to document, because in the end, what we are also kind of interested in is the passion for what is possible, as Harshmat says, and not necessarily only certified probabilities.
Absolutely. I mean, I was struck by the story of the electricity to the water, water supply connection, and it just made me. I mean, it just opened my eyes to the extent of this, the caste,
Yeah.
divisions that it really does open readers' eyes to that thing. I hope more people really read the book for that too. Yeah.
Right.
The last bit I just want to talk about is, because you have spent considerable amount of time in the book, is the public grievance redressal system that you have spoken of, and the various dynamics that are going in there, and the mukhya ward member dynamic, and how the ward member actually used the public grievance thing to to get a lot out of the mukhya. So my question is broader in terms of policy design. Okay, is it really possible to design a policy that can work in the interest of the system? I mean, make the system work in the interest of the ones it is designed for? And do you have some thoughts on this aligning of incentives of everybody, the incentive towards, one goal as such?
So let me just kind of briefly for the listeners at least tell the story of how ward members use the public grievance redressal system. So a grievance redressal system is basically something that, allows citizens to complain against the government. This is something that's found everywhere in the world. So hark back to Mihir's earlier question about public works programs or employment guarantees. Complaint systems you will find in every single city, in every single part, in every single village almost in the world. And usually you can pick up a phone, or you could go to some office and say, boss, my road is not proper, or there are potholes in my road, or the street light is broken, right? So this kind of a system was launched in Bihar with one key change in 2016, which was that it was a law. So citizens had a right to the redressal of their complaint. So it was not just an order or not just a system. If you had a problem, you could appeal it, and you could also go to court, which
And not
basically
just a
makes
favor that somebody was doing on you. right?
Exactly. It's not a favor. It's your right to kind of, it gives you dignity. It's a little bit like MNREGA in that sense. It's like something that the government says, no, we are here to listen to you, and you have a right to question us. So that's basically the system Bihar started. What is interesting about this whole ward member grievance redressal stuff is, here was a system built for citizens that was being repurposed by someone within government. This is a ward member who's in the end within government, who's now using a citizen-based system to lobby for their constituents. The reason that's happening is because these ward members are so power asymmetrically positioned that they're unable to actually negotiate even the local government system. So they need anything in their hands they find to appeal to the higher state, they're going to capture it or try and catch it and try and kind of lobby for their constituents. And this is basically what, and especially if you're a Dalit ward member, you're doubly disadvantaged. You are at the bottom of the caste hierarchy, you're also at the bottom of the village administration. So you will basically kind of latch onto anything you find. And in this case, they found the grievance system. I talk about this guy called Kamal Maji. Both of these are Dalit ward members, and how they kind of use the system to kind of lobby on behalf of their constituents. So where they file complaints saying, boss, I am not able to work in government because my mukhya, who's upper caste, is not giving me money to implement projects in my ward. So I need someone from the higher state to intervene and just kind of at least allow me to get the money that I'm supposed to get so that I can do the projects. And so that's basically how the system works. It beautifully aligns incentives in this case because, the state actually relies on various actors within the local government to kind of collaborate. That's how all state works, right? You need like different people coming together to work. However, when there are ethnic differences, caste differences between members, this causes a disincentive to people to actually work together. And then you have the complaint system that kind of realigns incentives in this very nice way. Now, what does this mean for policy design across the country? Can you always have ward members kind of file complaints? In your ideal world, ward members shouldn't be filing complaints. It's a citizen system. Citizens should be doing it, right? So that's obvious. But I think when there is a asymmetry in caste and hierarchy, Opening systems like this up to local government officials has two big benefits. One is ward members often make complaints not about themselves, they make complaints about their whole ward. So one complaint from me will help 200 households, ideally, right? Because everybody in my
Hmm.
ward now benefits from this complaint coming through. And the second is, I think that in a representative democracy, it is always useful to have people who represent you lobby for you across different fora. And so this grievance redressal system actually offers you a forum to kind of represent your constituents. So in some way, it's like a very weak version of some kind of a parliament or whatever. But that is still, it gives you, it kind of allows you to give you that. So that's basically, I think, why how these incentives are somewhat aligned these extremely particular circumstances. Finally, I want to say grievance redressal systems and social audits, right to public services. There are all these kind of different systems that are set up, kind of help citizens get what they want. And they all have different incentive structures, sometimes conflicting. But on the whole, I think like the NREGA, they don't work perfectly, but they still do important things that kind of furthers the process of development and makes development more democratic.
Sharon, I must say that hearing you talk about Bihar is absolutely fascinating. Hearing you talk about economics and policy design is absolutely fascinating. We could go on for another hour and you'll still be full of stories. And we must pause at some point. But before we close, I wanted to ask you a question about your current work. So you're done with the PhD, you're done with writing a novel and writing a book based on your experiences in rural India. And you're now officially a faculty member and doing research. So what is your current research like, and what do you see? I mean, in general, in development economics with a focus on India, what do you see are important research questions? If you don't mind commenting on that.
So let me start with what I am doing, and then let me move on to the broader question: what should we be doing? What I am doing. Let me start with the Karnataka bit because I am working with the Panchayati Raj department in Karnataka with a couple of co-authors, Vijayendra Rao at the World Bank and Siddharth George, who's at Boston University. And so the three of us have been trying to do two things. First is document how village task forces came up in villages during Corona in Karnataka and how that kind of changed how panchayats function and dealt with COVID, especially the first wave and also the second wave. So that's something we're doing. But also related to that, we're working on a project that kind of looks at this very big question in development economics, at least, which is, does decentralization work? Now, what does this basically mean? Well, Karnataka had this unique thing that happened, which is that during COVID, elections got postponed and a bunch of administrators took over government functioning across most panchayats. But there were some panchayats in Karnataka where you had elected officials who continued to govern. So you had this kind of very interesting dynamic where you could compare places that had an elected official governing versus district appointed administrators who were basically taluk officers of various sorts. And that kind of tries to kind of provide empirical pointers to the big question: is that how much decentralization should we get? What do elected representatives bring to the table? And I think that's an interesting kind of space. We're also trying to do other work in Karnataka because Karnataka has a fantastic local government system in terms of collection of taxes. They also have a very long history of improved local government system. So from the 80s onwards, thanks to Abdul Nasir Saab and other pioneers, Karnataka had a robust Panchayati Raj system in a way that I think only Kerala is the other state that had. So working on Karnataka, which is also my home state, I grew up there. I can read and write Kannada. I have aspirations of reading more Kannada, but and reading more Kannada literature and stuff. So as a personal level, it's a project that also immensely excites me. And I'm also working with some really great people, including the Panchayati Raj Secretary, Uma Mahadevan Das Gupta, who's a 2D for a powerhouse herself. In Bihar, we continue to work on one of the things I'm very excited about is we're doing work on peer groups and peer learning across ward members in Bihar, which I think is a very interesting kind of way to think about learning, right? So you have these ward members across different panchayats, especially if you're Dalit, you don't really know how to kind of deal with local bureaucracy. Can you learn from each other? So that's a big question. And that's something we're trying to do. There are other projects on, trying to document how elections work in panchayats, doing more quantitative work with social movements like BMW. So all of that is still ongoing. Now, to answer your bigger other question on development and what are the big questions, I think what we really need, and there's a crying need for this, and this goes beyond what is a big development question. I'm going to answer what kind of research questions should developed economists working on India focus on. And here, I think there's a big gap between what questions are being asked and focused on by mainstream academics who are often US facing, and what kind of questions should we be asking if we care about India's development. right? The American Economic Review, which is the top journal, which all of us want to publish in, of course, will say, okay, you did something worked in Karnataka. You are now going to do the same thing in Bihar. It's not that interesting a question. But for a policymaker in Delhi, or even like an economist who kind of wants to study India more deeply, it's very important to try and see, compare states in India, right? Karnataka versus Bihar, compare different policies or nitty-gritties of policies. There's a whole universe of questions on India that's related to public policy, but also development that nobody is, really doing good quantitative research on at the level at which it should be done. And so I think there is a crying need for a kind of India-facing, maybe Journal of Economics, that is kind of reputed, or an India-facing collection of economists who come together, who are based in India or who work on India but are based abroad. And while that constellation of people is slowly building up in the ecosystem, it will take a while. So I did answer your question of what are the big questions for development in India. Let me just say one thing there. I think the biggest question right now is how do we fix our failing healthcare system? It's kind of abysmal and failing. How do we fix? I think Kartik Mudizharan has done some exciting work on education, but there's a lot more work to do on how to improve our education systems in India. How to fix public schooling, I think, is a big question. And then, thirdly, 3 and 4, I'll say. Third is urbanization. All of us developer economists work in villages, or not all, but 80% of us. And basically, what that means is we have this urban chaos that we are not really studying. And urbanization is proceeding rapidly, and nobody knows what's going on there or how to kind of deal with that. And finally, fourth, and I think this is the thing that it's the saddest of all, is the environment. I think we don't have enough great environmental economics work based in India at a time when India is facing immense environmental destruction. I don't even know how to start to think about this. So those are the four broad areas I would pick.
Sharan, that was absolutely fantastic, and I think you did answer the question and more. I would just like to maybe offer a couple of comments. I think one, the point you made about whether certain policies or certain ways of doing things work across states is an important question, oftentimes not really appreciated by some of the top academic journals. I think this is if I were to offer a comment, replication studies are important and are being increasingly recognized in various areas
Right.
of research. And I think that goes to that direction. So even a journal that publishes replication studies or validation studies is something that in many disciplines is a need. And it was comforting to hear that development economics is also a domain where these things are important. I think the
Yeah.
other part I would really want to kind of say is, even though you outlined the challenges in policy making, challenges in development, and the fact that we have massive issues related to health, education, environment, urbanization that India as a country is dealing with. I think one of the things I took away from your book was that a lot of change can happen in relatively quick time, and also with very, very little by way of resources. I think
Right.
you begin your book by saying that all it took was one computer, one semi-literate man, and several hundred, mostly women, to wake up a sleeping state. And Sanjay Sahni's movement truly epitomizes grassroots democracy. What I think, what I took away from your book is not that there are no challenges, but more that there are mechanisms, there are ways, there are people working on this that are making a difference. And there are also government policies which, like NREGA and many others, which may be seen as failures or which maybe have an image of different, but the reality on the ground and the studies show differently. So I must say that the message from your book is positive, and I must congratulate you on that, and then also on the
Thank you.
research. And yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sharan. Sharan, any closing thoughts that you have before we can, call it a day?
Yes, I just wanted to say one last thing. The book was, of course, personal journey to kind of record what I saw, but the book is also a passion project because I wanted to communicate what I saw amongst the workers of Muzaffarpur, right? So I saw this kind of immense passion and immense spiritedness, and I really felt like these were things that I couldn't write in a paper, but I also couldn't communicate unless I wrote about it. And I wanted other people like all of you to see it. And so I want to end by saying I would encourage everybody to read the book, not because I want to be some great writer, but because all proceeds from the book go to the workers of Muzaffarpur. They've already been kind of committed to them. And so any purchase, any royalty, advances, everything go to them. So if you have read the book, recommend it to people. If you haven't read the book, try and pick it up. If you've read the book and didn't read it, still recommend it to people. If you read the book and didn't like it, even then maybe you should still recommend it to people because, in the end, all of this will kind of go help people who really are doing great work on the field.
Thank you. Thank you, Sharan. Just my closing comments on this is through the book and through this podcast, the one theme that has come to me, has come across very sharply to me, is how do we make our claims on the state? We in urban spaces and often cut off, like we live in our own, gated republics, as we call them, are often despondent, often helpless, and we completely secede from the state as such. From the depths of despair in Bihar, we have seen this story of hope, this story of resurgence that is coming up. So really, for us, it's just about how much action that we are willing to make to get our claims from the state. And so this book was enlightening, enriching, and enjoyable in different ways. Like Sharan said, it is also a project which contributes to a few people in Bihar. So making an appeal for everybody to buy the book, read it, and talk about it. We will close this episode. Thank you so much. Mir, you have anything to say?
No, thanks, Suman, and thanks Sharan for taking the time to join us. And all the best with your work. And we'll look forward to hosting you in Bangalore soon.
Thank you so much, Suman and Mir. This was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Habits? Routines? How exactly do they help us get better? Well, to simplify it for you, tune in to the Habit Coach podcast. I am Ashton Doctor, and I'm going to be here to help you get better daily with some simple, easy to do habits that you can easily adapt to your life. So tune in to the Habit Coach podcast from Monday to Friday, because I believe that awesome lives start with awesome habits.
सफर, रास्ते, मंजिल और मुकाम अक्सर ये हमसे कुछ कहना चाहते हैं, पर हम हैं कि अपनी रोजमर्रा की जिंदगी में इन्हें सुनने से कतराते हैं। नमस्ते दोस्तों, मेरा नाम है केशव चतुर्वेदी और मैं आपको ले चलूंगा कुछ ऐसे सफर पर जहां आपको एक नया नजरिया मिलेगा सफर और मंजिलों को देखने का। आइए इन किस्से कहानियों में डूब जाएं। हर मंगलवार और शुक्रवार